For the price of a cup of coffee, join my Patreon. The page includes audio documentaries not available on my YouTube channel. Link below in the description. Thanks for watching. By the end of 1968, the Beatles' finances were a mess. They'd started a company called Apple with no solid business plan, just a mission to fund struggling unknown artists. They'd earned virtually nothing that year. John was the biggest spender, followed by Ringo. John around this time was busted for possession of marijuana. He was staying in Ringo's flat when 8 policemen with sniffer dogs searched the property. Lennon had been tipped off about the drug bust 3 weeks previous. The floors had been hoovered before they gave the vacuum to their friend to dispose of. When they arrived, the couple were in bed, and at first they thought it was the press trying to get in. Then a policeman attempted to break in through the bedroom window, shouting, "Let me in, let me in." John was panicked and said, "Come round the front door, just let me get dressed." The policeman almost fell from the building during the commotion. After that, they searched the flat and found nothing. The dogs arrived and sniffed out some marijuana resin in a binoculars case and a cigarette roller. They were marched out of the property and driven to Paddington Green Police Station. Looking disorientated and panicked, Lennon and Ono appeared in court the next day. Fearing Yoko would be deported, Lennon quickly pleaded guilty. He was fined £150 and he was warned another offence would bring a year in jail. Meanwhile, Paul's relationship with Jane Asher had come to an end. Paul immediately started a new relationship with Linda Eastman. The White Album sold faster than any of their previous records, but there was no money coming in from Apple Electronics, Apple Films, Apple Publishing, or Apple Merchandising. Ringo later stated, "Apple wasn't being run, it was being run into the ground." Paul felt the solution to their problems was in live performance. He began telling the press at this point it was almost definite the Beatles would perform live again around Christmas. They never did. Due to constant bickering, this was the first Christmas the group spent apart in years. After the group shot a promo for Hey Jude, John too missed performing live as a group. George hated the idea. Their last performance at Candlestick Park, where John's hat was ripped off his head by a fan and a security guard was knocked out by a can of Coke, meant George wasn't eager to get back on stage. Paul was the most eager to return to live performance and began coming up with ideas. The well-documented project known as the Get Back Sessions began. They started work at Twickenham Studios, a film crew in tow, but soon decided they wanted to use a recording studio and they didn't want to use Abbey Road. John's friend Magic Alex had been commissioned to design a studio at Savile Row, and they all agreed that would be perfect to use. In 1968, 8-track recorders were common. Magic Alex promised the group a 72-track recorder he would build himself. As time went on, the 72 dropped to 16. When George Martin arrived at Apple's basement studios, he was stunned. The Beatles instructed George Martin, "You better put some equipment in." The idea was for the record to sound like a live performance, a nod to their rock and roll beginnings. John told George Martin, "I don't want any of your production shit." And George had no idea how to proceed. John at this point had begun to resent the rumours that George Martin was the brains behind the Beatles. George Martin had added instrumental tracks to the album Yellow Submarine, and John thought they were terrible. Glyn Johns, who worked with the Stones, the Kinks and the Who, was brought in to assist, and George Martin was pushed into the sidelines. Filming was wrapped up with a performance on top of Savile Row that was halted by the police. Ringo had hoped to get film of the police dragging him off the drum kit, kicking the cymbals over. The The Beatles had been looking for a manager since the death of Brian Epstein. John had met Alan Klein at the filming of the Rock and Roll Circus. In a meeting afterwards, John was impressed by Klein's musical knowledge and decided he would be the group's new manager. Paul was against Klein and stated at the time, "I don't like him, and I don't think he's the man for me." Paul wanted Lee Eastman, Linda's father, to manage the group. He had made Paul aware of Klein's suspicious practices. The rest of the group saw Paul's distrust of Klein as an attempt to gain more control of the band. George and Ringo liked Klein. His unconventional appearance and straight talk intrigued them. Paul was voted out and Klein was hired as the Beatles' official manager. The first thing Klein did was to fire all of the original staff at Apple Corps and replace them with his own. Eventually, Paul gave in and allowed Klein to act on the group's behalf in every financial arrangement they had. Their finances were in a mess. They'd lost a small fortune in bad merchandising deals. NEMS was collecting 25% of their earnings, and Apple was losing them hundreds of thousands. By March 1969, the Beatles were both unable to solve their differences or dissolve the group. None of the other three were invited to Paul's wedding. At the wedding, teenagers wept as Paul threw purple wrapped candies into the crowd. At the same time, George's house was raided while he was out. He was arrested for possession of marijuana, and the press had 2 headlines to choose from. Meanwhile, Klein had fired Magic Alex, and 8 days after Paul married Linda, John married Yoko in Gibraltar. 5 days later, John and Yoko held a bed-in for peace. They had decided, since they wouldn't be able to have a honeymoon without being hounded by the press, they'd have it in public. It was staged at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, Canada. George Martin was surprised when Paul contacted him to produce their next album. After being sidelined during the Get Back sessions, he believed he'd not work with the Beatles again. Paul stated, "He wanted to make an album the way we used to do it." Martin agreed if the group, especially John, let him produce the way he wanted to. George originally wanted the album to sound like one continuous piece of music, but John refused. John instead wanted all of his songs on one side of the album and all of Paul's on the other. The album ended up starting with individual songs and ended as a kind of rock opera. During the early making of the album, John released his second solo project with Yoko. It was called Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions. The opening track was 26 minutes of Yoko shrieking and feedback from John's guitar. Random noises can be heard throughout the rest of the album, with the addition of a 12-minute track of what sounds like John trying to tune into a radio station but never getting there. At this point, John had grown his hair and a beard. Rumours circulated he was to appear in a television series called Jesus of Nazareth. He never did, but stated, "If I do it, I want Yoko Ono to play Mary." John also changed his middle name from Winston, which he hated, to Ono. Back at Abbey Road, the group had disagreements over Paul's song Maxwell Silver Hammer. Billy Preston, who George had brought in during the Get Back sessions, would also play on the album. George's songwriting had always been seen as inferior to Lennon and McCartney. That changed when he wrote Something. Even George Martin was impressed. He didn't think George had it in him. Harrison stated he didn't care whether they liked his music or not. John took a break driving to Scotland, crashing his car and almost killing everyone aboard, and Paul took leadership role. John's first single, credited to the Plastic Ono Band, was released at this time. Give Peace a Chance had been recorded with a small group of friends during Lennon's bed-in. On release, as usual, Abbey Road sold at an incredible rate. At the time, critics stated it had a manufactured sound and disliked the production. Today, critics consider it one of the Beatles' best albums. George Martin later said it was his favourite Beatles album. A month after Paul's wedding, John announced he was leaving the band during a meeting at Apple. George was glad to get out. He later stated it had ceased to be fun and it was time to get out of it. Paul, on the other hand, didn't. The Beatles was his entire world. He loved the music they made and the adulation brought with it. For Paul, it made no sense to end the group. Privately, he held out hope that John would come round. It was agreed not to announce the breakup publicly yet. Paul fell into a depression and switched between two mindsets. Some days he loved the Beatles and some days he loathed them. He believed the other members had let him down by abandoning the dream they shared. Paul now felt he had no purpose. His drinking increased, and to make things worse, the Paul is dead rumours had begun. He spent long hours planting trees and helping Linda renovate the farmhouse, but he missed the group and he missed John. Paul soon began work on his first solo project, as did Ringo. Meanwhile, John released the Wedding album. The first side contained John and Yoko screaming each other's names. The second contained interviews with the couple. In January of 1970, John recorded a new single with the Plastic Ono Band called Instant Karma. Phil Spector produced the single and did such a good job, Alan Klein contacted him to produce the unfinished Get Back album. George Martin had earlier began production, but the project had been abandoned. Lennon had left the band at this point, and the remaining Beatles returned to the studio to record George Harrison's song I Me Mine. Phil Spector began work on the album. He included a 1968 track, Across the Universe, and added orchestral arrangements to the songs. McCartney hated Spector's production, especially on the Long and Winding Road. For the song, Spector had a choir of 14 singers and a 36-piece instrumental ensemble. The original cover was intended to be a replica of their first album, Please Please Me, which was taken at the stairwell at EMI offices. But the end result was a collage of the group. When the album was complete, EMI informed George Martin he would not be receiving producer's credit for the album as it was finished by Phil Spector. He later stated, "What the credit should say is produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." In a later interview for Rolling Stone, Lennon defended Phil Spector's production, stating, "Spector had been given a load of badly recorded tracks, and he made something out of it. He did a great job. When I heard it, I didn't puke." The album, now titled Let It Be, was released, and later that month the film of the same title premiered. The Let It Be album was the first Beatles record to be met with hostile reviews, and worse still, there'd be more to come.